Have you ever sensed that the more deeply you think, the more distant the world around you becomes? It's as if every layer of understanding you uncover quietly separates you from the people who once felt familiar. You begin to notice things others overlook, question ideas others accept without hesitation, and feel pulled toward truths that most people never bother to explore. And yet, instead of feeling enlightened, you often feel alone. But that loneliness isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that your mind is beginning to see what others are conditioned to avoid. Most people say they admire intelligence, but they admire it only at a safe distance. They like the idea of intelligence, the image of it, not the reality of what it reveals. Because genuine intelligence, the kind that questions foundations instead of decorating surfaces, makes people uncomfortable. It challenges their beliefs, exposes their contradictions, and forces them to confront the parts of themselves they'd rather keep hidden. That's why deep thinkers often feel misunderstood. Not because they're speaking a different language, but because they're speaking to minds that aren't prepared to listen. Think about how people react to different kinds of superiority. If someone is physically strong, we don't feel personally threatened. We may admire them. If someone is wealthy, we might envy them, but we don't feel attacked. But when someone is intellectually sharp, something shifts. People suddenly become guarded, defensive, even irritated, sometimes without knowing why. It's because intellectual depth doesn't just exist on the outside. It reflects something inward. It becomes a mirror. And when a mirror shows people a version of themselves they don't want to see, their instinct is to turn away, criticize, or dismiss the person holding it. Human psychology is wired for this. The brain protects the ego long before it protects the truth. When someone introduces an idea that digs deeper than surface-level thinking, most people don't interpret it as insight. They interpret it as disruption. It challenges the beliefs they've built their identity on. And when identity feels threatened, people shut down. They avoid, ignore, or reject the one who introduced the challenge, even if that person had no intention of making them uncomfortable. It's not malice. It's instinctual self-preservation. This is why deep conversations rarely happen in large groups. In crowds, people care more about how they appear than what they learn. They're not listening to understand. They're listening to maintain social status. So when someone speaks with depth, nuance, or unusual clarity, it puts pressure on everyone else. Suddenly, the group senses a shift, an invisible hierarchy formed not from authority but from awareness, and instead of embracing the person who sees more, the group often distances them to restore the comfort of sameness. People feel safer when no one is thinking too deeply. That's why deep thinkers often feel like they're from a different world. They're not trying to stand out, they're trying to be honest. But honesty, especially intellectual honesty, comes with consequences. It reveals structures people depend on, beliefs people shelter under, and illusions people cling to. When a deep thinker speaks, they unintentionally disrupt that delicate balance, and the world responds by pushing them to the edges. What makes this more painful is that society often rewards the opposite of depth. It rewards confidence over accuracy, simplicity over truth, entertainment over insight. People gravitate towards speakers who offer clear, bold, emotional statements, even if those statements have little substance. Meanwhile, the deep thinker, who sees multiple angles, who questions themselves, who moves with careful thought, is perceived as less convincing, not because they're wrong, but because they refuse to oversimplify reality. Nuance sounds uncertain to people who crave instant clarity. This is why the loudest voices gain the most attention, while the wisest voices struggle to be heard. It's not that society can't understand deep thinkers, it's that society isn't designed to. Everything from social media to workplace culture pushes people toward quick conclusions, easy narratives, and familiar beliefs. Reflection takes time. Depth takes patience. Truth requires discomfort. And most people aren't willing to invest any of that. Isolation becomes an unintended companion for deep thinkers, not because they choose it, but because the spaces around them really support the type of conversations they long for. They're surrounded by people, yet feel alone. They speak, yet feel unheard. They think, yet feel unseen. And underneath all of that is the constant pressure to shrink themselves just to fit into a world that fears what they naturally embody. But here's the quiet irony. History is filled with people who experienced this exact struggle. The individuals who shaped civilization were often the ones society rejected first. The thinkers who expanded human understanding were the ones mocked, dismissed, or cast aside in their own time. Society has always hesitated around minds that stretch beyond the ordinary. It celebrates them only after they're gone, when their ideas are no longer threatening. So if you've ever felt strange for thinking deeply or out of place because your mind doesn't settle for simple answers, remember this. You're not strange. You're just ahead of the emotional comfort zone most people live in. The world isn't rejecting you. It's rejecting the discomfort your clarity brings. But what does this mean for someone who thinks deeply in a world that rewards superficiality? Are they destined for loneliness, or is there a way to navigate the world without dimming their light? The truth is, deep thinkers aren't doomed to isolation, but they do need to understand the landscape they're walking through. Not every environment is fertile soil for deep ideas. Not every person is capable of carrying a meaningful conversation. Not every moment invites reflection. The world is filled with different levels of awareness, different emotional thresholds, and different capacities for truth. And when a deep thinker assumes everyone is ready to meet them at the same depth, that's when the disconnect becomes painful. It helps to recognize that most people operate on what psychologists call cognitive ease, the preference for information that feels simple, familiar, and effortless. If something demands too much thought, too much introspection, or too much emotional risk, the average mind quietly backs away. This isn't because people are incapable, but because they've spent their entire lives learning to avoid discomfort. A deep thinker doesn't avoid it. They walk straight into it. They've grown used to analyzing, questioning, and challenging their own beliefs. But for most people, thinking deeply feels like stepping into unfamiliar territory without a map. This gap in comfort levels creates an invisible distance. Not a physical one, but a mental and emotional one. You may talk to someone standing right in front of you, but the conversation feels miles apart. You bring up ideas that matter to you, questions about existence, consciousness, society, and instead of curiosity, you're met with confusion or silence. You try to open a door, but the other person sees a wall. You're reaching for connection, but the space between minds isn't aligned. That's why deep thinkers often feel too much for some people and not enough for others. Too intense for those who live on the surface, not intense enough for the few who think even deeper. They exist between worlds, the world most people see and the world beneath it. They walk a path with far fewer footprints because few are willing to venture there. This creates a unique type of loneliness, not loneliness from lack of people, but loneliness from lack of resonance. Meaningful connection requires shared depth. Without it, conversations feel hollow, interactions feel scripted, and relationships feel temporary. You begin to crave something more. Conversations that stretch the mind, challenge assumptions, and explore the invisible threads of life. Conversations where you don't have to shrink your thoughts or dilute your curiosity. Conversations where your mind doesn't feel like a burden. The good news is that this type of connection exists, but it's rare. Deep thinkers often find their closest connections in other deep thinkers, even if they meet few of them in a lifetime. Sometimes these connections come from books, philosophers, writers, or people online who speak your inner language. Sometimes they come from quiet individuals who, on the surface, don't look extraordinary, but possess a depth most people never take the time to discover. When two deep minds meet, the conversation doesn't feel forced. It feels inevitable, natural, effortless, as if both were waiting for the other to finally understand what they've been carrying alone. Until then, solitude becomes a natural companion, not a punishment, but a space where your mind can breathe. Deep thinkers don't fear being alone because their own thoughts are rich enough to accompany them. Solitude becomes a place of clarity, creativity, and internal growth, a private universe where their mind can wander freely without interruption or misunderstanding. But even so, the desire for genuine connection never fully disappears. It simply becomes more selective. It's important to remember that depth doesn't require an audience. Your thoughts don't lose value just because others can't grasp them. Your mind doesn't become smaller just because others mistake your introspection for distance, and your ability to think deeply isn't diminished by the world's inability to join you. Some minds illuminate landscapes others haven't discovered yet. And that's not something you apologize for. That's something you protect. But protecting your depth doesn't mean isolating yourself from the world. It means moving through it with awareness. You don't need to hide your thoughts, but you also don't need to offer them to those who aren't ready. You don't need to silence your mind, but you also don't need to speak it everywhere. Wisdom includes knowing where your thoughts will be understood and where they will be wasted. It's not your responsibility to convince people to think differently. Your responsibility is to honor the quality of your own thinking. And as you move through life, you begin to notice patterns. You notice that the people who mock deep thinking often fear it. The people who avoid deep conversations often avoid themselves. The people who dismiss philosophy, introspection, or existential questions often do so because they feel threatened by their own unanswered ones. You notice that intelligence isn't intimidating. It's what intelligence exposes that intimidates people. Not the thinker themselves, but the mirror they accidentally carry. This is why many deep thinkers develop a strong sense of empathy. Not the superficial kind, but the kind that sees the internal battles others hide. They recognize that resistance isn't always hostility. Sometimes it's fear, fatigue, or unhealed wounds. They understand that everyone carries different psychological weights, and not everyone has the strength or readiness to examine them. Deep thinkers can see beneath the mask not because they want to, but because they can't unsee patterns once they recognize them. Yet this awareness comes with a cost. When you see the world clearly, illusions lose their power. Distractions lose their charm. Conversations without substance lose their appeal. You begin to feel the emptiness in places where others find comfort. You sense the performative nature of social interactions, the repetition of unexamined routines, the fragility of beliefs people cling to. You start to see the world not as it appears, but as it truly is. And once you see the truth, you can't return to the blindness you grew up with. But clarity doesn't have to be a burden. It can also be a guide, a way to navigate life with intention, awareness, and authenticity. When you understand people's limitations, you stop expecting them to meet you where they can't. When you understand why the world resists depth, you stop taking its resistance personally. When you understand your own nature, you stop apologizing for it. That is the turning point. That is where isolation transforms into direction. Instead of asking, "Why don't I fit in?" you begin asking, "Where do I belong?" Instead of shrinking yourself to be understood, you expand your path until you find those who already understand. As you move further along this path, you start to realize that the world is not divided into smart people and not smart people. It's divided into people who question and people who avoid questioning. And avoidance, more than anything, is what separates the deep thinker from the rest of the crowd. Most people don't lack intelligence. They lack the willingness to step into uncertainty. They fear the discomfort that comes with questioning beliefs, examining emotions, and confronting contradictions. The deep thinker doesn't fear those things because they've spent a lifetime living in that space. The unknown is not a threat, it's an invitation. This difference creates a fundamental split in how people experience reality. For the average person, life is something they adapt to. They inherit values, absorb cultural beliefs, follow the patterns around them, and rarely stop to examine what they've accepted. For the deep thinker, life is something they examine before they adapt to it. They question everything, not out of rebellion but out of sincerity. They want to understand the truth beneath the surface, even if the truth is uncomfortable. Especially if the truth is uncomfortable. But this sincere search for understanding often puts them at odds with environments built on conformity. Workplaces reward predictability, schools reward memorization, social groups reward sameness, and society as a whole rewards those who fit neatly into the expectations it has already designed. A deep thinker by nature doesn't fit neatly anywhere. They learn differently, feel differently, question differently, and move through the world with a sense of curiosity that disrupts the routines most people depend on. And anything that disrupts the routine is often treated as a threat. When someone questions the familiar, it exposes how fragile the familiar truly is. Deep thinkers unintentionally reveal how much of society is held together by habits rather than understanding. They show how much people cling to ideas not because they're true, but because they're comfortable. They show how much of what people call normal is simply unexamined tradition. And that kind of clarity shakes the foundation most people stand on. This is why deep thinkers are often labeled as too serious, too intense, or overthinkers. These labels aren't reflections of the thinker, they're defenses. They're ways for others to dismiss what they're not ready to face. The world often uses language to minimize what it cannot comprehend. It's easier to call someone an overthinker than to admit, I don't want to look deeper because I'm afraid of what I'll find. And yet, deep thinkers rarely intend to challenge others. They aren't trying to change people. They're trying to understand life. Their questions aren't attacks, they're explorations. Their observations aren't judgments, they're reflections. But many people interpret depth as criticism simply because depth exposes things they're not prepared to see. Over time, deep thinkers begin to understand this dynamic. They realize that speaking their full mind in every situation is neither necessary nor wise. They learn to read the room, gauge people's emotional readiness, and choose when to share their deeper thoughts. Not out of fear, but out of respect, both for themselves and for the limits of others. This selective expression isn't inauthentic, it's strategic. It allows them to preserve their energy while still navigating the world with grace. As this awareness grows, the deep thinker starts to see a bigger truth. Understanding others is often easier than being understood. They can read emotions, recognize patterns, and sense unspoken fears because they have spent years analyzing their own. But the majority of people haven't done that level of internal work, so they lack the emotional vocabulary to understand someone who has. This imbalance makes deep thinkers feel like they are speaking in a language only a few can comprehend. But even with this imbalance, something beautiful begins to happen. The deep thinker starts to value connection differently. They stop seeking approval from crowds and begin seeking resonance from individuals. They start looking for conversations that make them feel alive rather than conversations that merely fill silence. They begin to notice the rare moments when someone truly listens, not to respond, not to defend, but to understand. These moments become precious because they bridge the gulf between minds. Every deep thinker eventually realizes that connection is not about the quantity of relationships, but the depth of them. They may not have dozens of close friends, but the few connections they do have feel meaningful, grounded, authentic, and intellectually nourishing. These relationships remind them that they're not alone, that there are other minds out there moving along similar paths, even if the paths rarely cross. Still, living as a deep thinker means accepting a certain level of solitude. Not loneliness, solitude. The solitude that comes from standing outside the noise, from thinking beyond what's average, from seeing what others overlook. And in that solitude, something powerful grows. A sense of identity that doesn't rely on external validation. The deep thinker begins to trust their own insight more than the world's approval. They begin to draw strength from clarity rather than conformity. They begin to understand that being different is not a burden. It is a direction. Once this shift happens, the deep thinker stops apologizing for their nature. They stop shrinking themselves to fit into conversations that don't nourish them. They stop pretending to be light when they are made of depth. They stop dimming their awareness to make others comfortable. They stop trading authenticity for acceptance. And they stop believing that they need to belong everywhere. Because belonging everywhere means belonging nowhere deeply. A strange thing then begins to happen. The more comfortable a deep thinker becomes with themselves, the more the right people begin to appear. The clearer their inner world becomes, the more clearly they can see who belongs in their outer world. They stop chasing people who misunderstand them and start attracting people who value their presence. Not because they changed who they are, but because they stopped hiding it. And with that comes a final realization. The purpose of a deep thinker is not to fit into the world as it is, but to expand the world as it could be. Deep thinkers push humanity forward not through popularity but through perspective. They are the ones who question what others accept, who challenge what others follow, who imagine what others fear, and who see possibilities where others see limits. They are the ones who create meaning in a world obsessed with comfort. They are the ones who awaken curiosity in a world distracted by noise. They are the ones who carry the torch of understanding into places where most people never think to look. Once you understand this, something inside you begins to shift. You start to see your depth not as an obstacle but as a compass, one that points you toward the kind of life you're meant to live. You no longer try to force conversations that go nowhere. You no longer wait for people to understand thoughts they've never explored in themselves. And you no longer feel obligated to simplify who you are just to be tolerated. Instead, you begin to build a life where your mind is not a burden, but a strength. You learn that most people don't fear intelligence. They fear what intelligence reveals. It reveals the gaps in their own thinking. It reveals the beliefs they hold without question. It reveals the emotions they bury beneath distractions. It reveals the illusions they rely on to get through the day. And when someone comes along who sees beyond those illusions, it triggers something ancient in the human brain. A reflex to protect the self, even at the cost of truth. So the deep thinker walks carefully, not out of fear but out of understanding. They know that truth has weight. They know that perspective has power. And they know that not everyone is ready to carry either. This awareness makes them more discerning with their energy, more intentional with their voice, and more protective of their inner world. Over time, the deep thinker realizes that their mind is like a light. In the wrong room, that light is blinding. People shield their eyes, turn away, or try to dim it. But in the right room, that same light becomes warmth. It becomes guidance. It becomes inspiration. The problem was never the light. It was the room. And this realization frees the deep thinker from the belief that they need to be understood by everyone. They begin to understand something far more important. They only need to be understood by those capable of seeing. This shift also changes the way deep thinkers view themselves. They stop interpreting their depth as an accident and start seeing it as a calling. They start to recognize that their ability to question, to observe, to analyze, to imagine, all of these traits exist for a reason. They exist because the world needs minds that can see beyond the surface. Minds that can notice patterns others overlook. Minds that can challenge assumptions others inherit. Minds that can articulate the truths others feel but cannot express. If every person thought the same way, nothing in society would ever evolve. Progress exists because some people dare to think differently. Innovation exists because some people ignore the boundaries others accept. Wisdom exists because some people seek understanding even when understanding is painful. And growth exists because some people refuse to settle for the simplicity the world tries to hand them. Your depth is not a mistake. It is part of humanity's design. Every generation needs people who can stand outside the noise and look inward. People who can sense what others suppress. People who can ask the questions others avoid. People who can see the long-term consequences of short-term habits. People who can feel the pulse of a world moving too fast for its own good. You are one of those people. And the world has always relied on minds like yours, even if it doesn't always know how to welcome them. And while the path of a deep thinker can feel quiet, the impact of that path is anything but. Even if you don't realize it, your presence influences others. The way you think influences them. The way you listen influences them. The way you observe influences them. You may not see the results immediately, but depth has a way of planting seeds. Seeds that grow slowly, silently, and powerfully. Sometimes your influence appears in moments you'll never witness. Sometimes it's visible only in hindsight. But it's there, shaping the minds around you in ways you may never fully understand. There will always be people who resist your depth, but there will also be people who are transformed by it. People who finally feel seen because of something you said. People who feel less alone because of something you expressed. People who find clarity because of the way you think. People who find courage because you were brave enough to ask the questions they were afraid to face. Your mind is not a burden. It is a bridge. And bridges don't exist to be understood by everyone. They exist to connect the few who are willing to cross. As you move through life with this understanding, you begin to embrace both parts of the journey. The solitude that sharpens you and the rare connections that nourish you. You stop seeing them as opposites and start seeing them as partners. Solitude gives you clarity. Connection gives you meaning. One deepens your insight, the other deepens your humanity. Together, they create a life that is rich, grounded, and authentically yours. And when you look back one day, you won't remember the people who dismissed you because they couldn't understand you. You'll remember the ones who valued you because they could. You'll remember the conversations that felt alive, the ideas that changed you, the moments where your depth finally met someone else's. Those moments are the reward for walking a path most people never choose. So if you've ever felt like you're thinking alone, know this: you aren't alone. You are simply early. You are standing at a depth that others may reach over time, or perhaps never at all. But that does not diminish your value. If anything, it proves it. The world doesn't need more identical minds. It needs more original ones. And your mind, exactly as it is part of that originality. So keep questioning, keep observing, keep imagining, keep thinking in the way that feels natural to you, even if the world doesn't always understand it. You're not here to fit into the noise. You're here to see beyond it. And the few who can meet you there, the few who can think with you rather than fear you, will find you. They always do. Until then, walk your path with confidence. Your depth is not an accident, not a weakness, not an inconvenience. It is your strength. It is your direction. It is your gift. And the world, whether it realizes it now or later, is better because you carry it.